The latest ASEAN summit concluded with ambitious promises but limited concrete action as Southeast Asian leaders agreed mainly to accelerate discussions on a regional oil-sharing arrangement amid growing fears of a global energy shock. While the summit highlighted rising anxiety over instability in the Middle East, shipping disruptions and escalating geopolitical rivalries, the gathering also exposed ASEAN's long-standing difficulty in acting quickly and collectively during major crises. Held under the chairmanship of Ferdinand Marcos Jr, the summit brought together leaders from across Southeast Asia at a time when the region faces increasing economic uncertainty. Much of the discussion focused on how ASEAN should respond to the worsening energy situation triggered by tensions surrounding the Strait of Hormuz, one of the world's most critical maritime oil routes. The narrow waterway carries a massive share of global crude oil and liquefied natural gas exports, and any prolonged disruption threatens to send fuel prices soaring across Asia, although ASEAN leaders issued statements emphasizing cooperation and resilience. The summit ended without the announcement of any immediate coordinated emergency response. Instead, leaders merely agreed to fast-track negotiations over a long-discussed oil-sharing mechanism designed to help member states manage potential shortages during crises. The proposal itself is not entirely new. ASEAN has spent years discussing regional energy security measures, but implementation has consistently lagged behind political rhetoric. The latest summit revived those conversations because governments across Southeast Asia are becoming increasingly alarmed by the possibility of prolonged disruptions in global oil supply chains. The regional concern is understandable. Many ASEAN economies remain heavily dependent on imported energy, especially oil and gas shipped through vulnerable maritime choke points. Countries such as the Philippines, Thailand, Vietnam, and Singapore could face severe inflationary pressure if energy prices spike sharply. Transport costs, food prices, manufacturing expenses, and electricity generation would all be affected almost immediately. Speaking after the summit, Ferdinand Marcos Jr acknowledged that the proposed fuel-sharing system remains far from complete. He admitted that ASEAN has never implemented such a mechanism before and that many difficult questions still need to be resolved. According to Marcos, leaders still disagree on how emergency fuel reserves would be allocated during a crisis, how payments would be handled, and which countries would receive priority access if supplies become critically limited. These unresolved issues revealed the practical difficulty ASEAN faces whenever member states attempt to move beyond broad diplomatic statements into real operational cooperation. Despite those complications, Marcos insisted that accelerating negotiations was necessary because the region can no longer afford to delay preparations for major supply disruptions. He warned that ASEAN economies remain vulnerable to external shocks and emphasized the importance of collective resilience. The summit unfolded against the backdrop of intensifying instability in the Middle East. Rising tensions involving Iran, shipping threats near the Strait of Hormuz, and fears of military escalation have caused governments worldwide to prepare contingency plans for possible energy shortages. For ASEAN, the threat is especially serious because Southeast Asia's economic growth depends heavily on stable energy imports and uninterrupted maritime trade. The region's manufacturing industries, airlines, shipping sectors, and urban transportation systems are all deeply sensitive to fuel price volatility. Several ASEAN finance and economic ministers reportedly warned during summit discussions that prolonged instability could significantly slow regional economic growth. Some officials expressed concern that inflationary pressures could reverse post-pandemic recovery gains that many Southeast Asian economies have only recently begun consolidating. Beyond energy concerns, the summit also highlighted ASEAN's broader geopolitical challenges. Leaders spent considerable time discussing growing tensions in the South China Sea, where territorial disputes between China and several Southeast Asian nations continue to escalate. The Philippines, under Ferdinand Marcos Jr., pushed aggressively for stronger regional coordination regarding maritime security. Manila proposed creating an ASEAN Maritime Coordination Center aimed at improving communication, surveillance cooperation, and crisis response among member states operating in contested waters. The proposal reflects the Philippines' increasing frustration over repeated confrontations between Chinese vessels and Philippine ships in disputed areas such as Scarborough Shoal and Reed Bank. Over the past year, incidents involving water cannon attacks, dangerous maneuvers, and maritime standoffs have significantly heightened regional tensions. While some ASEAN members supported stronger coordination measures, others remained cautious about adopting initiatives that could antagonize China. This again exposed ASEAN's persistent internal divisions over how aggressively the bloc should confront Beijing's growing influence. China remains ASEAN's largest trading partner, and several member states prefer maintaining stable economic relations rather than escalating maritime disputes. As a result, ASEAN often struggles to present a unified front on security issues involving Beijing. Nevertheless, summit leaders reiterated support for completing a long-delayed code of conduct governing behavior in the South China Sea. Negotiations over the code have continued for years with little substantial progress, but ASEAN officials claimed they are now aiming to finalize the agreement before the end of the year. Skeptics, however, remain doubtful. Previous deadlines for the code of conduct have repeatedly passed without meaningful breakthroughs. Analysts argue that conflicting national interests and disagreements over enforcement mechanisms continue to hinder progress. The summit also addressed the ongoing crisis in Myanmar, another issue that has repeatedly tested ASEAN unity. Since the military takeover in Myanmar, ASEAN has struggled to implement its own peace initiatives or pressure the junta into meaningful negotiations. Several member states reportedly expressed frustration that violence in Myanmar continues despite years of diplomatic engagement. Humanitarian conditions inside the country remain dire, and efforts to enforce ASEAN's five-point consensus peace framework have produced limited results. Some leaders advocated stronger measures against Myanmar's military authorities, while others preferred continued engagement and dialogue. Once again, ASEAN's consensus-based decision-making process limited the possibility of decisive action. The divisions over Myanmar further reinforced criticism that ASEAN often prioritizes diplomatic caution and internal harmony over effective crisis management. While the bloc frequently emphasizes unity and consensus, critics argue those same principles often prevent rapid or forceful responses when urgent action is required. Energy security, however, dominated most summit conversations because the economic consequences of a prolonged global oil crisis could be devastating for Southeast Asia. Countries across the region are already experiencing pressure from volatile commodity prices, slowing global trade and weakening consumer demand. An additional energy shock could significantly damage industrial output and household purchasing power. Singapore, despite being one of the region's wealthiest economies, remains heavily dependent on imported energy. Thailand and Vietnam also face growing concerns over fuel costs and electricity demand. Indonesia and Malaysia possess some domestic energy resources, but still remain vulnerable to broader global market disruptions. The proposed ASEAN oil sharing arrangement aims to create a framework in which member states could support one another during emergencies by sharing fuel reserves or coordinating supply management. Supporters argue that such a mechanism could reduce panic buying, stabilize markets, and prevent severe shortages. However, implementing such a system would require enormous logistical coordination and political trust. Member states would need to agree on reserve levels, transportation systems, financing arrangements, and emergency distribution priorities. Questions also remain regarding whether wealthier ASEAN members would be willing to subsidize poorer states during severe crises. Some analysts believe those political sensitivities may eventually limit the effectiveness of any regional fuel-sharing arrangement. Despite those concerns, leaders insisted the summit represented progress because it acknowledged the seriousness of the threat and created momentum for further negotiations. Prabowo Subianto reportedly warned fellow leaders that energy pressures are unlikely to disappear soon. He emphasized that ASEAN must prepare for a prolonged period of global uncertainty rather than expecting quick stabilization. Prabowo argued that geopolitical tensions, climate disruptions, and strategic competition between major powers are reshaping the global economic environment. According to him, ASEAN must strengthen regional resilience if it hopes to maintain stability and growth. His comments reflected a growing recognition among Southeast Asian governments that the international system is entering a more unstable and fragmented phase. Rising tensions between the United States and China, conflicts affecting global shipping routes, and disruptions to supply chains are forcing regional leaders to rethink long-term economic strategies. Several summit participants also discussed the need to accelerate investment in renewable energy and regional power grid integration. Some officials argued that reducing dependence on imported fossil fuels should become a major strategic priority for ASEAN over the coming decade. However, transitioning away from oil and gas remains a complicated challenge for developing economies that continue relying heavily on affordable conventional energy sources to sustain growth. The summit's outcome therefore reflected both urgency and limitation. ASEAN leaders clearly recognize the scale of the risks facing the region, yet they continue struggling to transform diplomatic consensus into immediate practical action. Observers noted that ASEAN summits often produce carefully worded communiques emphasizing cooperation and solidarity, but implementation frequently remains slow. The latest gathering appeared no different. Critics argue that ASEAN's consensus-based structure makes decisive action extremely difficult because every major initiative requires broad agreement among members with very different political systems.